was first introduced to this book when my mother bought it for me as a present at Dollar Tree because she thought I'd enjoy the book and she urged me to read it. It did sit on my nightstand for a few weeks without being touched, until I noticed it lying around again, and I decided to pick it up and start reading it. I didn't expect it to be my cup of tea, as I'm not really on board with the whole young adult fiction romance novel thing, but let me tell you, when I finally put down the book, it was nothing like what I had initially expected. The novel centers around the 17-year-old protagonist, Emma, who, after coming home from boarding school for winter break, witnesses her mother suffer from a psychotic break. And Emma discovers for the first time in her life that her mother suffers from schizophrenia, and that she had been suffering for years before her birth, but Emma didn't know until now. The main plot of the novel is supposedly the protagonist fretting over the news of her mother's condition, and struggling as her mother is temporarily sent to stay at a mental hospital. Before reading the book, I thought such a plot would be intriguing, and because of this, I did give the book a chance. However, the overall plot is weighed down with many other unnecessary threads and unnecessary themes, and I had several issues with this book that I am getting ready to discuss. By the time I finished it, I was so relieved that it was over, and proud of myself for finishing the entire thing. This review contains several spoilers about the book, so if you are reading this book, or will read this book and don't want the plot to get spoiled, skip to the time that I have placed on the screen. Still here? Good. Overall, I was severely disappointed with the overall execution of the story, some of the unfortunate and, to be honest, rather inappropriate themes of the story, and the flat and unlikable characters. Even though the story is supposed to be about a daughter experiencing the effects of her mother's mental illness for the first time in her life, the protagonist seems to spend just about as much time or more pining over boys and stressing about romantic relationships than being concerned about her mother and the state of her mother. Emma constantly worries about her relationship with her boyfriend Daniel, whom she seems to have a poor relationship with, and doesn't really seem to get along with him well. Daniel is portrayed as a carefree, daring young man, who also seems to be a bit on the immature side, just like just about every other young adolescent character in the novel. He isn't very understanding of Emma's situation with her mother, and he angers Emma several times throughout the novel, sometimes for understandable reasons, such as, for example, trying to convince her to go to a party when she doesn't feel like going, and not really seeming to care about her and her mother's situation, but for other times very silly juvenile reasons, such as one instance Emma gets mad at her boyfriend because he disagrees with Emma's position that white men shouldn't be allowed to wear dreadlocks, and another time for going to a movie with his friend. The book portrays Daniel as being a jerk, and while I agree that Daniel was very narcissistic and immature, just about every teenage character in the novel behaves in a similar way to the way he does. So he really isn't any worse than the other adolescents in the novel. Emma feels jealous of Daniel's connection with his family, which seems rather forced to me, at least since his parents don't seem like very responsible or caring parents, as they frequently permit their 17-year-old son to drink with his girlfriend, and smoke marijuana, and have sexual relations with his girlfriend of 4 months. In real life, I would assume that such parents would be neglectful and don't care much for the well-being of their children, but in the novel, his parents are portrayed as the most caring parents in the world, which to me seems like a tad bit of a contradiction. Since Emma really doesn't seem to get along with Daniel and thinks he's a jerk, one might ask, why doesn't she break up with him? Well, I'll tell you why, dear viewer. That would require strength, intelligence, and confidence. 3 things that the protagonist unfortunately lacks. Emma is every bit as awful as Daniel is, yet somehow because she has a stressful situation with her mother, and she is the protagonist, she gets away with just about everything that Daniel doesn't get away with. In fact, Emma gets away with a lot of things in the novel, and her poor choices never have any real consequences. For starters, Emma is 17 years old, and frequently drinks and experiments with drugs, has casual sex, and frequently profanes, as does just about every teenager in this novel, which really isn't a good example to set for young people, and she never experiences any real ramifications for her actions. The worst thing that happens to her is that her boyfriend Daniel, who was already portrayed as an insensitive jerk anyway, breaks up with her because he eventually finds out that on New Year's Eve she gets heavily intoxicated and has sex with her friend, which I don't really see as an adequate punishment for the protagonist, as the relationship seemed rather unstable to begin with, and Daniel isn't mature enough to handle a serious romantic relationship properly. Emma's friend with benefits, Phil, is a young man whom she meets while she is hanging out at her best friend's house, and later meets again when visiting her mother at the hospital, and discovers he has a twin brother who suffers from mental illness, and because of this, Emma feels a connection with Phil that she doesn't feel with Daniel, and for some reason Phil is portrayed as a much better person than Daniel could ever be, and he's frequently described as wise and mature. While this kid may have more experience with dealing with family members that have mental illness, I'd contend that he's just as foolish and immature as Daniel, because he engages in exactly the same debauchery as the rest of the young people in this novel, and he uses Emma for sex, and knows that she has a boyfriend and simply doesn't care. Which doesn't seem like a good friend to me. Phil to me just seems like the typical stupid, immature teenager, and really is no better than Daniel. The love triangle is what takes up around half of the novel, and it seems like the whole situation with Emma's mother is a mere afterthought, even though it's supposed to be the focus of the novel. Emma is more focused on boys than her mother, and Emma in general uses her mother's situation as an excuse to engage in many foolish behaviors and poor choices. Emma's mother throughout the novel does slowly recover, and part of me wishes the novel was more about the mother than Emma, as she is infinitely more likable, and is much more engaging and developed than Emma is, which is rather unfortunate since Emma is the protagonist and her mother is simply a supporting character, with a fraction of the novel devoted to her. In fact, just about almost every adult in the novel is more likable than their adolescent counterparts, which is saying something since they are all mere background characters. Emma, Daniel, Phil, and all of the adolescent characters in the novel are flatter than a cardboard cutout, and make the tiny little kiddie pool in my neighbor's backyard look just as deep as the Pacific Ocean. Overall, I did not enjoy this novel one bit, and just finishing it felt like a big accomplishment to me, even though it was only around 250 pages, and I finished it in 3 days. It is such an easy read, yet such a hard read. Unfortunately, I don't feel that I can recommend this book to others, with all the gratuitous profanity, heavy drinking, drug usage, casual sex, overall poor choices made by the characters in this novel, the romantic plot tumor that just seems to overtake the story, and the flat, unlikable characters. I can't think of a single redeeming quality about this book. It's a difficult read, and I simply cannot recommend this book.